Excellent. Welcome everybody. This is going to be a really full session, so we're going to go ahead and get started even as others join us. My name is Jen Anderson. I'm the Clinical Quality Improvement Director for CHAMPS, the Region 8 Primary Care Association, and thank you for joining us for the fourth session in our Resiliency Collaborative that we're doing in collaboration with the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center. Today's session, it's going to be a part 2 to Andrew Laue's first session. So if you're able to join us in June, that's fantastic. If not, no worries. You will follow along today with no problem whatsoever. But I do want to point out that the recording to Andrew's first session, if you love what you hear today, is available on our website and the website for the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center. And we'll share those in the chat as we go along. So with that, I am going to kick things over to Molly Malloy, our facilitator for this series.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy to have you here and very excited for this session again today. I do want to let you know the session is being recorded. The recording is on already, so just to be aware of that. And with that said, I'm going to just do a quick introduction of Andrew. Andrew is a licensed clinical social worker, a psychotherapist in private practice in Missoula and Montana. In addition to the clinical work that he's done with individuals, couples, and families, Andrew supervises 30+ psychotherapists in the Western Montana region. He is the chief trainer for the National Association of Social Workers and Montana's chapter for the clinical supervision course, which is amazing. In 2017, he won a National County Association Award for his secondary trauma group work with the Missoula County Attorney's Office. He is passionate about creating sustainability for human service professionals, which is why we are here today. He consults with many agencies about the delivery and complexity of mental health services and practice. These include First Step in Missoula at St. Patrick's Hospital, Partnership for Children, Intermountain Mental Health Center, Partnership Health Center, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribal Services Social Services Department. He is a leader in the LGBT community in Montana, and he has developed cutting-edge interventions for diverse groups, including his HIV prevention work with the MSM and IDU population, for which he won the Governor's Award for HIV prevention in 2003. A decade ago, he was a part of a development of an award-winning documentary film, Red Without Blue, which has become a founding document in search of equitable treatment for transgender people. He resides on the Flathead Reservation in rural Montana and is passionate in his commitment to serve the Native American populations in this region. And with that, he is actually in Helena, Montana today, where I am. So with that, welcome, Andrew, and over to you.
Thank you, Molly and Jennifer and the team that's allowing us to work with you guys again today. Just a couple things about our learning process together. There's a lot of new cognitive material that we'll learn today and also some review of concepts we worked on in our last session. But one of the best ways to learn the material, the practice skills that we're going to be working with today, is more of an experiential learning model. And so one thing to do if you have the capacity to create more of an interactive learning platform would be to utilize your camera on versus camera off, because it helps to kind of create that dynamism. We're not actually able to make eye contact through the screen, but it is helpful to kind of view people and to see how they're responding as we practice some of these skills together. So that's one way of engaging. Also, utilizing verbal engagement and using your on-off button for the mute to be able to make responses as we move through these skills together. And then also we'll be monitoring the chat. So the chat is also a really effective way to respond. I'm working together with Molly to create this kind of dynamic learning experience in the next hour. So just invite and welcoming you guys into any of those that you'd be able to engage. So one of the things we always do in the beginning of Secondary Trauma Activates Resiliency Training, STAR-T, the work we do, is we work with this arrival activity. And I know we worked with this last time, so we'll just repeat that again as we start this hour-long training, this simple 4-step activity. So the first thing I'd invite you to do, just as you begin this training process is notice how we can utilize the skill of awareness to bring our awareness out of the Zoom and into the room that we're in. So take a second and just bring awareness to the room that you're in. And just noticing first the quality of contact your body is making with the chair or the floor. Notice if you're kind of slightly up off the chair or the floor, or if you're potentially collapsing down into the chair or the floor, or if you have that sense of being met by the chair or the floor. This is just not fixing, it's just tracking, it's just noticing. So many of these skills are about tracking. So then the second step is just orient yourself to the space that you're in. A mammal would do this in the wild if they're moving around from location to location. They're going to arrive, they're going to scan for safety and orient. We use our 5 senses just like any other mammal would to do that. So notice first the quality of light in the room that you're in. Notice things like shape or colors or shadows. Then activating the sense of sound. So just noticing sounds first in the distance. And then sounds closer in. Shifting to that sense of touch. So notice any sensations of temperature or humidity on your skin. Notice if you kind of scan the space and look off behind each shoulder like a mammal would look for risks in the wild, that stretch can actually also help to create regulation in the body. And then the third or the fourth and fifth element of smell and taste, just activating those together, just to get a sense of this space that you're arriving in. This helps the body to regulate the nervous system that we're going to learn about. So the third step, this is toughest on Zoom, especially with not a lot of screens, but it's just to begin to make conscious connection with each other. So if you do have the capacity to look into each other's Zoom screens, just to notice that we're trying to make contact with each other. In work settings, that connection is a key to resiliency. And then take a second just to think about you as you're getting started with this learning today. Just check in on your mood or your energy level, or maybe your level of connection or disconnection with this training process already. What's the one word that describes you just now as we're getting started? So my word is smooth. I'm feeling really smooth this afternoon. Who else? What's your word? Just one word that describes you. I'd love to hear it verbally or in the chat.
Hopeful.
Hopeful, hopeful. Who else?
Open.
Open, open.
Decompressing.
Decompressing in the chat. And you guys notice I'm repeating the word and I'm trying to get the exact tone and intensity. And that's a mirroring response that signals welcome to mammals. So there's this resonance that we're extending as part of the arrival. Who else? Like, what's your word? The other words that describe you as you were beginning this morning, this afternoon. All right, so just getting a sense of us as we begin is a really effective way to begin to build resiliency right in the core of the organization. This 4-step arrival activity is something that many first responders, legal teams now, medical teams will utilize in lieu of what we call the narrative check-in. You know how that rolls. Like people check in and they talk about their cousins and their Costco cakes and all this stuff, and it kind of burns up all the meeting time and tends to activate people more than regulate. So we're doing this regulate, connect, and resonate just as we begin, which are the essential skills you're going to see that we need to actually build strength in the middle of the trauma that we engage. So just as a brief review, we talked a lot last time about how secondary trauma spreads like a wildfire. And we mean that what happens is when we engage trauma in our work settings, our mirror neuron systems actually activate in order to create connection and empathy. And we actually mirror the same traumatic material that's running through the nervous systems of the people that we're connecting with. And it will actually rewire our own nervous system. And we hold this secondary trauma deep inside our own physiology. And we talked a lot about how the COVID pandemic, has made these great impacts in terms of overwhelming workers, and how many of our models don't really support workers until they're overwhelmed. But one of the things that we're trying to do with this training and this material is move to the front end of the work culture and really try to protect the human resource that does this essential work with this skills-based model of operating, so that we have a skills-based approach that's informed by these 4 theories that we spoke about last time, so that we are at the cutting edge of providing resources to our workers so that they can actually not just protect themselves from the wildfire of secondary trauma, but so that they can learn about their brain and how it operates and their nervous system, so that they'll be able to more effectively manage the threat that gets activated in their nervous system as they work with the drive of the work setting. Remember, we talked last time about how many of our work settings are so filled with red or threat, and we have such drive at work that work runs like red, green all the time. And how part of this work is to bring the power of the blue or the nurturance system on board into our work cultures. And I know we explored these slides together that gave us information about how we can identify how our nervous systems are impacted, like this worker, or in this image of the heart that we worked with last time, so we can begin to create this process of what we call post-traumatic growth. And this is the formula that we communicated to you guys initially that kind of organizes the way we think about how secondary trauma and resilience actually work. So just to review, the red box indicates that trauma is always with us. Like, we're not going to fix it. We're not going to etch a sketch trauma out of the human experience. But if we have the ability to engage it, that's why there's this plus sign in the formula with these 2 kinds of strategies or skill sets: our connecting skills and then our awareness skills, which means tracking how our nervous system is working. If we can do this at the same time and provide venues for this to occur, the result is going to be growth or resilience. And just at the end of our training last time, we were working with one of the elements in the toolbox of resilience, which is called our morning grounding activity. So what I want to do for the rest of this training time today is we want to review this morning grounding activity, and then we're going to add 2 new skills to your toolbox. So at the end of this 60 minutes, you're going to have resources to track how your nervous system is working when it's being impacted by the secondary trauma that you engage in your work setting. So let's return to this morning grounding activity. This is a chance at the very beginning of the workday to make a connection with the place inside of your own system that we begin to identify as calm and strong. It's like an anchor or a regulatory space deep inside our own physiology. Now, the reason this is important in terms of trauma theory is that we know that if we just engage trauma, like if you connect with the trauma around you or in your coworkers or in your family system, if we don't add regulation to trauma, physiological regulation, what we do is we run the risk of what we call spreading the red. We just like spread the narrative of the trauma. I always think about like investigators who will come into police departments and present all the grisly data of what they've just observed, like into the administrative structure. That's an attempt to offload the tension that's in them. But then what happens unconsciously is they spread that red throughout the entire administrative structure. So we actually spread the wildfire of secondary trauma. But if we're going to build in this power of resilience, if we can have each worker have a capacity to regulate themselves from deep inside their own system as a familiar place that they can engage their workday with, this is going to be a very effective way in actually turning that trauma into the building of strength or capacity. So the way that we teach the morning grounding activity is through a series of body tracking activities. And so I'm just going to invite you experientially to go through this body tracking activity with me briefly, so you can revisit the experience of landing this anchor, this calm, strong place, like deeper into your awareness. So take a second, again, noticing the power of awareness to bring your awareness out of the Zoom and into the room. And notice whether you're standing or sitting. I'm actually going to stand just to notice, again, the quality of the weight of your body in the room. So just noticing if you're kind of up off the chair or floor or collapsing down, or that sense of being met. Then begin just to activate that sense of the five senses again, noticing which of the senses help you arrive in this space, whether it's visual or sound or touch sensation or smell or taste. So then for the third step in this body tracking activity, allow yourself to bring your awareness to the inside of your body or your physiology. We call this introception. And invite your body to allow you a place inside your system that can be an anchor spot for you. So this is this place that feels calm and strong at the same time. You know, for some people, like that's a place that's always changing. For other people, it's always the same place. Like for me, it's always where my feet hit the floor, but it's different for each person. You know, I worked with some whitewater rafters and it was their hips, because that's where they're familiar with anchoring against the boat when they move into rapids. I remember working with a team of runners from Runner's Edge, and the idea of a regulatory space or an anchor felt too heavy. So their calm and strong was that burn feeling on their thighs, where there'd be that kind of dynamism of a long run. So just begin to ask yourself with this noticing awareness, where your body is going to allow this calm and strong place. And then the fourth step in this tracking activity is just to become aware as you bring awareness to that anchor just now. Ask yourself, what's the quality of the sensation at the anchor? Is it smooth or pulsing? Is it flat or undulating? How is that anchor operating inside the power of your internal physiology, where we want this spot of regulation or calm, strong, to be able to be a place that your physiology is familiar with? Okay, so just inviting you back into the Zoom. So when you did that activity and you tried it with me, what did you notice? What did you notice? And again, we talked about this in the last training, but we're not that interested in what your thinking brain is observing or judging. Like you might be, oh, that Andy's not much of a yoga instructor or something. But I'm curious, like, what did you notice as you tried that? Love to hear from one or two of you or several of you, just to get a sense of that noticing skill. What did you notice?
So I noticed that I went straight to my heart area, and that actually really surprised me because it doesn't always feel that strong.
Yeah,
But
and then
where I
Molly,
went today.
Molly, when you went there, then with that fourth step, what was the sensation of it there this morning as you arrived there?
It was calm. I mean, it
Oh,
yeah, it was beating. I mean, there was no fluttering, no rapid heartbeat. It was just calm.
got it, you guys. So notice how skillful it is when Molly gives us that detail of the tracking of her physiology, we can feel that with her in our own nervous systems, even across the Zoom, in a much richer way than if she just said, oh, I went to my heart and it was calm. Do you notice how that detail activates the lower brain, and that helps to create regulation? Those are the same neurosystems that spread the secondary trauma. When we're working with regulatory skills and building those in ourselves and in our teams, the same neurosystems build that capacity for regulation. Anyone else? What'd you notice? I'm curious.
We had in the chat box, focused on my stomach and felt full and happy.
Okay, so it went to stomach and then full and happy. Now, a couple things about these activities. One of the things we know is practice helps to build these skills. That's why we call it the morning grounding activity. What we really want people to do is just to take this space to create practice in their nervous system. So on a regular basis, they know how to track into their body to create a regulatory space in its core. So the way we teach this as a skill is we encourage people at the very beginning of the day, before they start their day, to take a moment to pause or stop and basically just drop in to that anchored place. It doesn't take long. It's just that if you actually bring your awareness internally so that you're actually feeling from the anchor, that regulatory drop-in becomes a place that your nervous system can return to over and over throughout the trauma exposures of the day. So that's the first skill. And I remember in COVID, I was, doing a lot of online like this, and I would just set up my computer and my phone and my coffee and everything. I would just step away before my first client, and I would just drop into that place where my feet hit the floor. But then we've added in other skills to give it more value. One is we encourage people to take this skill out into the natural world. One of the things we know about developmental trauma is that many of our workforce, myself included, we have our own trauma stories or trauma narratives. And for many of us, the body alone is never going to be safe because it's the scene of the crime. And so if you can add in the connection with the natural world, many people can anchor much better if they're doing it outside and can feel the participation of like bird song or light or breath. I remember for me early on in the pandemic, I was working at home and I started moving out to this cottonwood grove behind my house. And there was always this power of moving the morning grounding to those trees that gave it an extra level of power. And then the second add-on is that we utilize skills that come from EMDR processing theory, and we check in with what's happening in the rest of our system while we're anchored. So one of the things I did during the pandemic, I remember going out to anchor at the tree, the cottonwood, and when I went out there, my phone beeped a notification. It was like about 3 months into the pandemic, and it said 10,000 people are now dead in the United States. And when I stopped to anchor that morning, I was scared. And I never would have even tracked that fear was there if I hadn't paused to acknowledge it. And we know we can't fix it, but there's something about acknowledging it with the dual awareness of the anchor spot in the body, the regulatory spot, and then the acknowledgement of the tension fields that actually helps to create a sense of desensitization or connection. And then the third add-on that we do is this add-on of what we call neuroplasticity movements. So movement is a really important way for the body to discharge trauma that's caught in the physiology. And so the kind of movement is slow movement with awareness. Think about like Tai Chi movements. And so oftentimes what we encourage is for people to, find the anchor spot, potentially do it outside. And then as they're checking in, instead of doing it with the one feeling word, notice all the things that are happening in the system. And from the anchored place, just let the body move to begin to express that. And we know that all of these add-ons with the basic skill create a really effective way to begin to build capacity with this morning grounding activity. And I can give you tons of examples of teams that were initially resistant to this, It sounds too woo-woo. How do you get your staff to do it? And the reality is, when we practice these skills with our nervous system, it starts to make a huge impact on think about it this way. If you were going to go on a bike ride, like a mountain bike ride, and your tires weren't pumped at an adequate level, if they were either soft or overly tight, not regulated, the quality of the ride and the success of that adventure would be impacted. And so what this does is it creates an optimal regulatory zone, the right kind of pump inside of the system. So as we engage traumatic material, we actually have a regulatory place to come to right as we're doing the work that allows us to have this optimal level of engaging the trauma around us, because it needs us to connect with it. I mean, mammals need to connect with each other in the middle of threat to make a difference. I mean, an ER doc can't avoid the trauma of the setting, or a social worker can't avoid the pain of the client, but we move toward it with this regulatory process deep inside. And that's part of what helps to create the power of this resiliency. So that's our first skill, first of our awareness skills. And it's a review. And I consciously reviewed it because I have really benefited in these last 3 to 5 years of practicing and teaching these skills. These aren't things you can cognitively learn without repetitive practice. And so the more we review these and the more we create opportunities in our work culture to practice them, the more effective they are in terms of building capacity for our workers. So the second skill that we teach is called tracking the regulatory process throughout the day. This skill I think of as the front line of protection from secondary trauma. Because what this skill is about is it's noticing the way that trauma is entering your own system from the work that you're doing as close to the entry point as possible. And so in order to do that, if you think about what we learned last time about the tripartite brain, we use the thinking brain to track the cues in our body, physical sensations of when the traumatic material is moving into our system. Again, we utilize this skill of noticing. Remember, noticing is just observing what's happening, and we're not trying to solve or fix, we're just tracking. I also like this diagram that kind of describes the way the tripartite brain and awareness works. So we use that eye of awareness. We've been practicing it already today in this training, in the room, out of the Zoom, that kind of awareness shifting. We're using awareness shifting with the wisdom of the tripartite brain. So we use the thinking brain to track what's happening in our body cues that help us intervene with the trauma right at the moment in the middle of our workday where it's entering our system. So basically what we're doing with this skill is we're tracking the way that red threat system works, of the red, green, and blue. We're tracking the way that that's working in our own bodies, in our own neurology. And so this is the map of what we're tracking. Now, this map comes from the work of Pat Ogden, and she's a very groundbreaking psychologist who about 15 years ago wrote a book called Trauma and the Body that revolutionized the way we think about the way that trauma works in the human system, because it was integrating a lot of the knowledge that comes from neuroscience that talks about the power of our physiology of our body to hold the trauma. And medical people and psychologists and therapists and workers weren't tracking things that way until Pat described it this way. So I just want to walk you through her map so we kind of know what we're tracking. So the first thing that happens in the middle of threat is we go into the top part of the map. That's that high activation, that fight or flight, that hypervigilance. It's going to look like this, right? So look at the body cues on this character that indicate that high vigilant response. Like you see the dilated eyes, and then the startled position of the hands, and then notice the flushed cheeks, the rush of energy in the system. These are all cues that the body is in that vigilant state. And that was designed to help protect the system. The problem is, in a lot of our work cultures, we have so much threat that's happening all the time that our systems will keep going up into vigilance and we can't really sustain that, or it doesn't solve the dilemma. So then what happens is the threat system has this second function where it collapses down to the lower part of the map. And that's what Pat called hypoarousal, or sometimes it's called freeze or collapse. In work settings, I like to call it functional disassociation. So your work, you're functioning, but your regulatory system is just keeping it all on the down low. So take a look at this image of these three soldiers. Where do you see the functional disassociation in the image? Who's functionally disassociated, would you say? Anybody?
I was waiting to see if anybody was going to answer, but I would say the person on the left-hand side of the screen.
Got it. Okay, so Molly, when you look at the image, the soldiers in the middle, they are doing what we call the connecting skill. Like in the middle of trauma, battleground trauma or threat, we need other mammals to mirror and support us. This guy in the back that you identify, he's sort of protected. And like, look at this, look at the cues, like look at his helmet, look at his body posture. And then he's like, got that little book thing, like he's doing something that's occupying him. And like a lot of functional disassociation, people will just track details. I always see that image when it's on a big screen. I want to pull out my phone and put it in his hand because I feel like our phones have become our functional disassociation devices throughout COVID, right? It's like, how many thousands of people just like me? Kind of like a Facebook thing, right? Instead of like dynamic engagement, we are in a kind of constant state of disassociation. And we know that this dramatically increased during the online work that came with COVID, where there was a dramatic increase, for example, in liver transplants, because so much of disassociation working online was aided by the use of alcohol or substances, so there's like a disassociative process that's a part of managing the trauma that we engage in our work settings. And so Pat Ogden didn't like teach us about these states. Like we knew they existed, but as therapists and as medical people, we just didn't really know what to do with them. Like we thought these were symptoms that needed to be cured, right? So like if someone was activated like at the top part of the map, we would just give them a benzo or like put a kid on a behavior program or ask someone to download the Calm app so they can just calm it down, right? It's like fix it kind of mentality. And then I got to say, many of us are never been good at tracking disassociation. I mean, COVID really blew that open because it was so profound. But I know that working in trauma with children and adolescents for years, the kids that were most profoundly impacted on this map didn't show signs of distress. They don't have IEPs or behavior programs or therapists because they're not high vigilant. Their trauma has been so severe that they're already just in that bubble like most of the time. I think about a kid I worked with for years who was the subject of incest in the family and been removed from the family. And I had 7 years of awesome clinical notes. And he read every Harry Potter book over and over in my waiting room in those first 7 years. And he was in a bubble the whole time. And finally, when I learned this material and started to apply it to our therapy work, for the first time, I was able to bring him up into that mid zone that we're going to learn about, which was Pat's great contribution of that window of tolerance, which is that mid zone of balance between high arousal and high collapse. And when he finally was able to be present with me, and then we could work from that position, I asked him, I was like, do you remember any of that work we did for 7 years? Because he was functionally disassociated. He said, nope. He goes, Andy, you have a great candy bowl in your office and I love your paint colors, but that's just about it, right? So it's like, so what we need to do is be much more effective, according to Pat Ogden, of not solving these dilemmas, but as seeing these as protective stances that our system is doing. And that she taught us that what we need to do is come to the mid place of balance between high arousal and collapse. And she called that middle band in the map the window of tolerance. And the idea is in the middle of the threat itself, if you can get your physiology into that system, that that place in the map, then the energy of the system goes towards growth again. The energy at the top and the bottom part of the map is there to protect the system. But as we consciously move towards balance, then we start to move forward again. So I'm a simple, like, imagistic thinker. So I just think about that as the sweet spot in the river by my house. I live on the Flathead River, and there's this wide river with a big current going down the middle. And if you get your float boat or your paddleboard in that part of the current, it's effortless movement forward. So to apply Pat's theory, what we do in this skill is we just track the banks. And the more we track the banks, the more we track in our own physiology the evidence of high arousal or the evidence of collapse, the tracking itself, the noticing, brings us more into the window. So look at it here. It's like the more we track, we're in high arousal, we track, we move into the window. Maybe we go back down and out. It's not a static thing. It's something that's moving with us as we move through the trauma of our work system. And so we begin to track this as we do our work, tracking the banks, the evidence in our body through body cues of these states. So let's return to this image of this guy again. So look at his cues for vigilance, and then think about the cues in your own system that are vigilant when you're in the middle of threat at work. The more specific you are about how your own body responds, the more you're going to be able to use this skill. So take a second and think about your own system. When you're in a vigilant stance in your system, what's the evidence in your own body as a cue that you're in that space? I'm curious. What's your cue?
Rapid heart rate.
Right. So rapid heart rate. And then if I was working dynamically, like in a live training with this, I'd say, do you feel it first as heat or beat? Right? Do you feel it as rhythm or heat?
Heat.
Heat, right? So we're getting much more clearly the specifics of it. So that's usually one. There's like clenchers of the jaw. We have people that do this stuff with their shoulders, all of these different things that are ways of creating tension in our systems. So
we also got a sweaty Betty in the comments.
Sweaty Betty, I saw it exactly. So it's like, what we need to do is become much better at tracking these cues. Just let me give you an anecdote. I don't know if you guys know where Missoula 911 is in Missoula County, but it's in the basement of our courthouse where there's no natural air or light, which is kind of a hell of a place to put people who are having a traumatic impact on their nervous systems, like every 30 seconds, answering phone calls, right? So when I asked them in the training I did with them what their own body cues were, no one could answer. No one knew in the first training. But the wisdom of the people who built that training center, or that call center, they set it up so when you're working there and taking call, you can see 4 other people taking call so that humans could see other humans. They all knew the cues of the other 4 people, right? They knew their cues, which is evidence that this stuff is happening all the time. What we have to do is develop the skill to track it. And so just to reinforce that this is tracking, not fixing, I just wanted to describe the way I first developed this skill, because it was literally the first time. I'm 60 in 2 weeks, but the first time about 15 years ago when I was 45, that anyone ever even introduced me to the fact that I had a body with a nervous system that was being impacted by the work I did. So it was about 15 years ago. I was trying to figure out how to figure out all this embodiment stuff that was coming into the literature. And I thought, I need to find a good massage therapist. So I tried to find the best massage therapist in Missoula. And it ended up to be 2 practitioners that worked together called 4 Hands Massage. They're energy workers. They have the hot rocks and the essential oils and the funky new age music. I mean, these practitioners were dialed in. And so I go to the first massage and I loved it. Just loved it. And I was like, I'm signing up for 10 more. So I bought 10 more sessions and I went to the second one. And I was like 10 minutes in and they just stopped working. So they stopped. And then one of them, Renee, looked at me and she said, Andy, she goes, you probably don't want to hear this, but we think it's important to tell you that the whole time you were receiving that massage a week ago and 10 minutes into this one, every time we touched your body, your lower body from your waist to your feet, you push back with such tension and rigidity in your system that your tissue was so hard that we couldn't get our fingers into your tissue. And I was like, Renee, actually, I wish you hadn't told me that. I was like, let's get back to the new age music. I mean, like, this is not something I wanted to face. But she was like, look, I'm going to teach you, we're going to teach you collaboratively a body cueing strategy. And it's going to be way more important than any massage we can give you. So I was like, let's go for it. So what we did is they would work. And then when I would tighten, they would tap my shoulder or my upper thigh as a cue for me to release. And we started doing that. And in those first few sessions, they were tapping me with this cue like 15 to 20 times in an hour. That's how automatic the nervous system is to respond to these threats. So we started tracking. We did it every session for about 10 sessions till finally we were tracking it enough, if you look at this diagram, that I was able to stay in the window rather than to do what was happening, which is they were touching me and I was going into vigilance, my system, and I wasn't able to benefit from the massage. So then I was able to stay in the window enough to actually benefit from the therapeutic aspect of the body work. So then I had a tracking skill. And the first place I took it was to work. Because, as a therapist, I work in a really open stance with my clients. I'm absorbing a lot of their material into my system as I engage them. And basically, I was doing the exact same thing in the therapy chair. My upper body was all connecting. And whenever I'd be overwhelmed or afraid, my lower body would be tense. I'd be slightly pushed back in my chair, holding myself rigidly. So I just started to track it. The first year I tracked it every hour of every therapy session, and I was doing it like 6 times an hour. I track it to this day. Now I do it like 3 times an hour. I haven't fixed it, right? But that's the point, right? It's not about fixing this stuff. This is happening constantly. It's tracking. And the more I track, the more I'm managing my own nervous system, and the more I'm going to grow from the work that I do, right? So the other way to think about it is this. If this was a brain, right? This is trauma coming at you from the work you do. It doesn't come in as a challenge to your thinking brain or a thought. It's not like, hey, I'm this guy's trauma, solve me. It comes in at that 1/100th of a second into those body cues deep inside our system. And if we can notice with the cue right when it's there and just soften and invite it out, it's like a windshield of protection. It's like using the awareness right in the moment of the work itself so that I'm not overly absorbing and then reacting in my own nervous system, but I'm present and responsive both to my client, but also to my own nervous system's need to be regulated and to be engaged effectively so I don't collapse from the work, the good work that I do. People who don't have this tracking, they keep absorbing and they keep absorbing. I've been famous for this. And then you end up either exploding on your partner or souring your work environment or becoming physiologically overwhelmed and then eventually collapse. So bringing in this tracking skill, I mean, to me, in settings like we work in, medical settings, all these settings, this should be an essential skill. Like, why would we bring people into our work settings, invite them to utilize their whole self, and then not give them wisdom and strategies for how to manage their own nervous systems? So these are very effective ways, both the morning grounding activity to create the regulatory place inside my own body, and then this tracking of how my body is shifting with this goal of moving to the window, that really create like effective tracking skills or awareness skills to build strength inside of our work culture. So you can tell I'm excited about this skill because I feel like it's so effective. And I really do believe it's the thing that in the last 15 years singly that has helped me to sustain the effectiveness of my work. Because I'm tracking my own nervous system, my clients don't get more, less they get more. It's like 2-for-1 therapy, right? Like we're working on whatever they're working on, but every time I regulate my own system, their mirror neuron system picks that up, even if we don't talk about it, and it starts to impact them positively as well across this vast body-to-body nervous system at the lower brain. So the last skill I wanted to leave you guys with today is what we call transition rituals at the end of the shift. And so you can see these 3 skills are kind of a suite of awareness skills that if you utilize them all together, they kind of cover the front end, the back end, and the middle part of our work culture, our work day. But this is a skill that gives us a space somewhere in our day to begin to identify the material that's still stored in us from the work we do that's kind of trapped in our nervous system, so that we have ways of effectively noticing it and releasing it on a regular basis. So we know that one of the dilemmas of the COVID pandemic, but it's also dilemmas in most human service work cultures, are the boundaries between things. You know, it might be the boundary between the personal and the professional, or it might be the boundary between home and work, or work and home. Sometimes it's the boundary between things that happen in our workday. We first developed this skill actually when we were consulting with the ER team at St. Pat's in Missoula, the social work team, and they were being traumatized or absorbing secondary trauma every time they went into another patient room where there was a crisis. So we built the transition rituals with them at the exit from the patient's room back out into the corridor before they went into the next room. So they had it right in the middle of their workday. Many people have these at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. But let me be clear what I mean by ritual. We're not talking about any kind of like esoteric religious practices. You know, there's nothing here that's scary in that sense. We just mean repetitive practices that are sometimes playful, symbolic. Oftentimes there'll be metaphor or humor or music, movement, imagery that helps to create a dynamic, like pleasurable, ritualized activity so that we'll actually track what's happening in our system and release it. And so these rituals need to be individualized to each person's particular sort of capacities or each person's sort of unique flavor or strategies. And so I like to utilize the elements of the natural world, earth, air, fire, and water, to give people doorways into thinking about how they could build rituals that work more effectively for them. Because, you know, sometimes people are more earth oriented. Like these are the people that are going to like garden at the end of the day. They're going to need to be out in the natural world, like connecting with nature. They might gather, you know, the rock gatherers or getting rid of things. Think about dog walkers. They're big earth related people. If you look at this image, notice how there's these really predictable agrarian lines in the painting. Predictability is really a big thing for earth-oriented folk. They like the same thing to happen, almost like the rhythm of the seasons. Like, you know, the dog walkers are always going on the same walk, like same 5 rocks the dog pees on, like same 6 people they say hello to. You know, it's like that predictability and rhythm becomes a part of the transition. But air-based folk are almost completely opposite. They can just let it go anywhere. Just like, I always think of those comedians that just like blow the water out their mouth or let the balloons free or just exhale, drop it, let it go. I worked with a team of folks from our homeless shelter at the Poverello Center. And when we did the training together as a group, we all built these activities, these transition activities together. And we found out that half of their team, when they drive home at night from a shift at the POV, have the windows down in their rigs and their sunroofs up, even in winter, because it's the air. Like they need the air to come into the cab as they're moving through the things that are left in their system and blow it out of the cab and out of their bodies itself. So the air becomes quite powerful. Fire folk are different than that. Like they need the heat, they need the intensity, they need the activation to actually move the material. I was thinking about some physicians I worked with from a surgery center here in Missoula, and they're like, those like 35-year-olds that they do interval training and they're super buff and they don't have time to do anything else because they're physicians. And they were like talking about the heat of their workout in the morning and this like way that they would get their systems overheated through the interval training. So we just tried to use the workout as the transition activity. So I encourage them to think of themselves as a smokestack on top of the treadmill. And as they're building up all this heat and discharging it, we had them track with awareness the things that were left in their system from the workday before. Like it might have been like a botched surgery or a difficult biopsy report. And to acknowledge that with the heat of the workout, and then to use the metaphor of heat to allow it to move out of the top of their head, almost like burning smoke out of the top of a smokestack. And as one of the physicians said after she'd practiced this for a couple of weeks, she said, yep, and then you step off into the endorphin rush of the new day. So then water has been like a really effective purification element across cultures for centuries. I mean, think about Christian baptism, or think about the sacred rivers in Southeast Asia. Water has this capacity to release. I know for me, I get to swim in the Flathead River in the summer at the end of on Thursdays and Fridays. And it's like that 10 minutes in a live body of water can move material out of my system that feels like it would be stuck in there for a century if I didn't get in the water. So think about these elements like earth, air, fire, and water. And then in order to kind of demonstrate how we utilize these strategies to kind of build these ritualized activities, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to describe a transition that I did for about a decade. And I want you guys to listen. Is it earth, air, fire, or water, or a combination of those that's kind of informing this transition activity? So what I used to do when I lived in Laue and worked on North Reserve in Missoula is I would go out to my vehicle that's parked in the front of my office building at the end of my day. And before I get in the driver's seat, I would pause and I would just track what was left in my body from the day of work with clients. And sometimes for some reason, I just started to use metaphor and I started to think of what was left in there as kind of like a toxic snowpack. Some days the snow was like really heavy and wet. Other days it was like diaphanous, kind of like all over the place. I couldn't even like name it. It was just all around me. Other times it was sharp, like frozen, and it would cut you because there was pain connected to it. But whatever it was, I would always stop and I would just pull it up out of the top of my head and I would put it on the roof of my truck. And then I would get in the truck and I would drive out to North Reserve, take that left, head up over the Costco Hill. It's this overpass to Costco. And I would just start to imagine in my mind's eye, this toxic snow flying off my vehicle and like crashing all over Reserve Street and like all over the vehicles behind me. Then I get on the other side of the Costco Hill, I dump a bunch more. I get down to Mullen and Reserve where there's this long light that you're always waiting for, like a Walmart thing there. And I could feel the snow kind of like melting down the sides of the vehicle and then sort of pooling underneath. And then I just splashed through as I go through the light. And then I get to the turn to 93 South and I take it really sharp just to kind of blow off the last little bit of material that was like stuck on my vehicle. And then I drive pretty fast the last 7 miles home. And we have a rule at my house now about in for about 10 years, that I always have to take a shower before I talk to my partner at the end of a therapy day. So what elements do you guys hear in that? Earth, air, fire, or water? I'm curious. What are the elements present in that?
I heard all of them.
Yeah, name one, Molly. What one did you hear?
Well, the one that relates most to me is the shower at the end of the day with water. But also kind of the grounding of pulling things out, you know, you're grounded in the space at your car. But there was just water with the snow and the shower.
So Molly, it's interesting. The power of using metaphor is that I always thought the water was the water, the shower. But then when I started doing these trainings, people pointed out the snow is toxic water. And I'm like, wow, my ritual is metaphorically wiser than me, because it starts with toxic water. And then at the end of it, there's that release of the cleansing water of the shower. So definitely water. Someone says in the chat, air is taking the snow away, right? There's that blowing quality. That's the air. And then Molly was mentioning also the earth. There's actually two earth elements. So one is the giving it back to Reserve Street. And I don't know what your guys' relationship is with your box store streets, but for me, that's the best use of Reserve Street, just to like hold my secondary trauma. And then the other piece is notice the predictability. It goes intersection to intersection. And that tracking really helps me. Like by the time I get home, I've tracked all of these things across the landscape that help me release the material out of my system. Now, I don't live down there anymore. I live up on the Flathead Reservation. And so at the top of the hill at Evero, there's a casino and an animal bridge, which is a tunnel that I have to drive through. And if you guys had x-ray glasses to see secondary trauma, there are piles of my stuff on the Missoula County side of that tunnel, because I am not letting it get through, because Lake County has enough of its own trauma. You know what I'm saying? A couple other things about this, and I know we have to end in 2 minutes. I was doing this training with these transition rituals down in Stevensville with a group of teachers who are therapists who work in a school setting. And one of them said to me, she was like, Andy, I just can't do that. I have a second job. I don't have time. And I was like, well, listen, I think we can make a transition ritual out of anything. So it's like, what's your job? And she's like, well, I'm an organic farmer. I have an egg business. So I go, you go home and do farm chores, basically. She goes, yeah. And I was thinking like movement's important. So I was like, show me what you do. And she's like showing me these like chicken feeding movements that she does as part of her farm ritual. So I'm like, this is perfect. I go, just track the trauma that's stored in you through that day of work with the kids and just start feeding it to the chickens. So she looked at me like I was crazy. And then she said she'd try. And literally like 6 weeks later, I saw her at a farmer's market and she was waving and doing this, like all at the same time. So I go over there, I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, listen, she goes, it's working. She goes, there's something about doing it every day. It's getting it out of my system. I feel more refreshed. I'm more hopeful. And I want to tell you guys, I was super jacked for her, super delighted that it was working. But I do want to tell you, I stopped buying my eggs from her because I did not want to get that trauma-fed chicken egg stuff back into my life in any way. I'm managing my own secondary trauma. I did not need it in her eggs. So that's one of the narratives about how effective this stuff can be. So thank you guys for being able to like share these 3 skills with you. And there's lots of ways, like if you get access link to our website, we can show different ways to practice these skills. We have videos we can share with you and more learning. But thanks for this chance, all of you guys, to be a part of this training process today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you everybody for joining us. And I'm going to turn it back to Jen for some final comments.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much. I will follow up with an email that will include Andrew's website and a follow-up an evaluation, which would be super helpful if you could share your thoughts on today's session. And please do join us again in September, the first Friday in September, and we're going to hear again from Molly and Gina will be joining us for that last session. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful August, and we'll see you all real soon.
Take care, you guys.